thank you everybody for whoever's watching. Thank you so much. And thank you, Saeed and Dr. Osamah. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for doing this. We really appreciate it. And yeah, and again, I apologize for the technical difficulties, but we're live now. So just to get a few things out of the way, first of all, my name is Muhammad. I'm the executive director here at the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center. And closer. And we're happy to have you online here today. And I hope you will be tuned in to our future events as well. Just to get a few things out of the way. So we have another event on the 27th of May with Dr. Rashid Khalidi. We have a book talk. So please stay tuned to our website and our emails for that as well. And also, if you enjoy these programs that we have here at the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center, please consider supporting us with a donation, or at least let your friends and family know about us. That would be great. So thank you all. So today, in this virtual talk that we're having, we have Saeed Arikat and also Dr. Osamah Khalil, and they will be discussing the history of the Nakba, which has now been 72 years ongoing. And also it created the largest and longest running refugee problem in the world. They will also discuss the present and future status of Palestine, especially in light of ongoing attempts by Israel and the US to suppress the Palestinian struggle for freedom and justice, including through Israel's imminent annexation of the West Bank, which of course would be illegal under international law. So just to give a little bit of a background about our speakers today, we have Dr. Osamah Khalil, who is an associate professor of history at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He's the author of America's Dream Palace, Middle East Expertise and the Rise of the National Security State. And he's also the editor of United States Relations with China and Iran Toward the Asian Century. Dr. Khalil has also been a frequent media commentator and contributor, including for the Huffington Post, Los Angeles Times, The Hill, The National, Al-Quds al-Arabi, al-Akhbar, and Jazeera. Saeed Arikat is a member of the Palestine Center Committee here, and he is also the Washington bureau chief for the Palestinian newspaper Al-Quds, a daily for which he is a writer, columnist, and analyst. He previously served as a spokesman and director of public information for the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq, and currently he teaches as an adjunct professor at American University here in Washington, D.C. So thank you both for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we're looking forward to this presentation. So I guess we can get started, and if we can get, if both of you can, chime in on the issue of the Nakba, and it all started back in 1948, and just if you can give us a background of what happened, what transpired in 1948, how did Palestinians get kicked out of their homelands? What forced them to flee? What happened? For the people that don't know about specifically what happened at that time, if you could please give a background of that so we can go forward with that.
Okay.
You want me to go first? Osamah, or you want to go first?
Saeed, go ahead. I can hop in. I can chime in after.
Okay. Well, thank you, Muhammad, and thank you, Osamah. I'm honored to be with you, and thank you for all those participating online. Very briefly, it is Nakba today, the 72nd anniversary of Nakba, the commemoration, is really significant and has a special connotation, But we should not look at the Nakba as just a one event that happened in 1948. The truth of the matter, this had been going on for a very long time, since the late 19th century, with the coming of the first Zionist settlers who came and took the land and began to take the land with all means possible, and then began to be far more aggressive and far more emboldened with the beginning of the British mandate and empowered by the British mandate to do so. So this tragedy of the Palestinians and Nakba had been going way before and still going on today. It is still going on. It has gone on for the past 72 years. It was going on before then. So it is definitely existential for the Palestinians. It has impacted every Palestinian, every in the region, every Arab, everyone in the world in one form or another, because it still goes on. We need to remember, Muhammad, because you mentioned what happened and so on. In 1948, the Zionist gangs, Stern and Haganah and all these things, before the formation of the State of Israel, were able to, ethnically cleanse Palestine of about 800,000 Palestinians. They basically destroyed some 700 villages. They literally massacred at least 16,000 Palestinians during that process, during that time. And it went on and turned them into refugees. It drove them into the West Bank and drove them into other Arab countries, the adjacent Arab countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the Hashemite Kingdom, Jordan at the time, and so on. So that is the background. But we must also keep in mind the Nakba goes on because I don't believe that Israel or Israelis will ever reconcile themselves to accepting the Palestinians as a national entity. Okay, so the idea of let's say displacing the Palestinians is really fundamental to the founding of Israel, to its continued existence, as a matter of fact, because let's all remember that Zionist settlers came into Palestine with a notion, and with the help, of course, of Europe, with the notion that Palestine was a land without people, and they were a people without land. This still stands today, and this is not born out of ignorance or in ignorance. No, it is basically, it is fundamental to the policy of the continued Israeli presence and the continued Israeli occupation of the Palestinians, the continued Israeli ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, demolishing of homes, stealing of land, expropriation of land, and what we have seen, I don't want to dwell too much on these points because we're going to come to them in the discussion, but what we have seen this year is really the culmination of this, because the Zionists feel finally, it is time for the Palestinians to declare Israel's victory. Finally, it is time for them to submit and surrender. That is the point. I mean, when you look at the deal of the century, the elements of the deal of the century is just that. It is just that. It talks about, Bantustans. The Palestinians are only as good as their presence does not bother Israel in any way, shape, or form. They're not a society. They are welcome to go and work, let's say, as day laborers in Israel. But other than that, no, they wish them to be away. They want to wish them away. They want them to be driven away. And let's not kid ourselves. This will continue to be the mindset. It will continue to be, the drive behind Israel. And I don't know. I am not very optimistic about, having some sort of a two-state solution or anything akin to that. I don't believe Israel will accept a Palestinian state that is sovereign, that is national, that can, where Palestinians can gather and so on in any way. It will accept possibly something akin to the village leagues, something akin to what we have seen in the deal of the century, which basically says, yeah, I mean, Palestinians can have a state provided that they prove they are worthy of that state that is, fragmented. It's like everybody uses the term the Swiss cheese way and so on. So the Zionist, very simple. I mean, I just want to conclude my opening statement with the following. The Zionist methodology, the Zionist drive, or ideology will not accept any kind of national entity for the Palestinians anywhere. If they drive all the Palestinians, let's say, across to Jordan, for instance, and I don't think that Zionist aggression will cease or will end right there, because it sees itself, or it sees its existence through the continuation of conflict, and not only through the continuation of conflict, as long as this conflict can be, from their point of view, resolved to their advantage. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Said. Mohammed, also thank you for hosting the event, and thanks to everyone who's listening in. And Said, thank you for participating and for your comments. I want to take a step back and build a little bit on a number of Said's points. I think when we think about the Nakba, so I think one of the things we should also do is for those watching who may not know what that means, it means catastrophe, very simply. So the catastrophe, the destruction of Palestinian society, the creation of the world's largest and longest refugee population. And often when we talk about the Nakba, it's juxtaposed with Israel's Day of Independence, right? So the establishment, the creation of the State of Israel in May 1948, and with that, the destruction of Palestinian society. And so it's, to Said's point, I think Said makes a very good point that the Nakba doesn't begin in 1948, nor does it end there, right? So we can go back and we should look at how did this occur? Because this was basically your question, Mohammed. How did this happen, right? And I think we can look at we should think about 5 factors. I think one, Said makes an excellent point, that we have to look at, one, the role of the Zionist movement, its ideology, its policies, and the support it received from, one, the great European powers, but also the United States. And how the Zionist movement was successful in implementing, one, the idea first of a Jewish national home in Palestine, and then the creation of a Jewish state there. Right? The second aspect that we need to think about is, what was the role of the British Mandate? So and again, not to do too much of a history lesson, but this is at the end of World War I, the division of the former Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Empire's majority Arab territories, and the creation of these new states, one of which was the British Mandate of Palestine. Right? But several other states were created, including, as Said mentioned, Transjordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, all of which were formerly part of the Ottoman Empire. But one key aspect I think that we can't ignore is that in the creation of the British Mandate of Palestine, that the British were committed, one, to the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, right? And as they claimed in what was known as the Balfour Declaration, which was also incorporated into the terms of the mandate, right? That the rights, the civil rights, if you will, not the political rights, but the civil and religious rights of the indigenous population, the non-Jewish population, would not be impacted by the creation of a Jewish national home there. And so part of what unfolds during the mandate period is that the British are never able to resolve these contradictions that are inherent in the creation of the mandate or in the Balfour Declaration, nor effectively do they want to, right? So what we see in Palestine during the mandate period is that, unlike any of the other mandate territories, Transjordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, there's no parliament that's created. There are none of the governments that are supposed to be established and advised by the British authorities, including the key positions of government, prime minister, foreign minister. None of this is done in Palestine, and that's deliberate, right? Because in effect, what the British are doing is on two levels. On the one, they want to serve as an incubator for the Zionist movement, helping the Zionist movement create a state within a state. The second thing that we can tell as historians is that by the 1930s, we are already seeing policies and proposals whereby the Arab population of Palestine will be merged with the Arab population of Jordan. So in other words, to Said's point, there was never an intention of creating a Palestinian Arab state. That was, from the perspective of Britain and the perspective of the Zionist movement, always supposed to be Jordan, okay? This brings us to the third factor, that we should think about what happened and how did 1948 happen, and then we can talk about some of the basics of what happened. But the third is, what about the Palestinian Arabs? What about the leadership of the Palestinians? And why were they so unprepared for what happened in 1948? Why were they so unsuccessful in not only preparing the population for it, but in galvanizing and mobilizing the population for it? Now, some of that has to do with the policies of the mandate, which one, as I mentioned, was not interested in encouraging the development of a Palestinian Arab leadership, but also, as we see across the British and French empires, actively engaged in a policy of divide and conquer, right? So dividing up and competing, leading Arab families, Arab notable families, making them compete against each other for different positions, for support from the British movement, from the British authorities. So one of the things that we can dig into and that people should dig into, and you know, you're going to have a book talk next week, and Professor Khalil has written a lot about this, is about the failings of the Palestinian Arab leadership during the mandate. The fourth thing, and to Saeed's point, is the role of the Arab states, these new Arab states that are being created. And we can't ignore, and we shouldn't ignore, that many of these were not only created by Britain or France, but that their leadership was utterly beholden to the British authorities. And this is especially the case in the two Hashemite kingdoms, the Hashemite kingdom of Iraq, and then the Hashemite kingdom of Transjordan and later Jordan, right? And those two will coordinate and collaborate with the British authorities to ensure that no Palestinian state emerges, but also are really helping to facilitate what becomes the Nakba, right? In particular, not just the dispossession and the creation of this massive refugee population, but the erasure of Palestine as a geopolitical entity. And finally, what we can't ignore is the role of the United States, which we'll come back to, I think, again and again. But the role of the United States before, during, and after the Nakba, the U.S. is going to play a really important role here. One that, you know, we focus a lot on Britain because it's the British mandate. But one of the things we need to think about is by 1948, the United States is the world's greatest power. You have the emergence of the Cold War, and a number with the Soviet Union, and a number of these factors will play into what the United States decides to do in and about Palestine and towards the Palestinian refugees.
Okay, thank you both. One specific question that I wanted to ask is, what kind of, you know, what happened exactly to the you know, the average Palestinian in the lands of 1948? What kind of violence, what kind of intimidation did the Zionist terrorist groups inflict upon them? Because I think people don't really, or at least the average American or the average person does not know exactly what happened. But like, for example, I saw a post recently of, it was a picture of somebody's village after it was all said and done. Right. There was a band of, you know, some of these Zionists that were going through and looting all of the homes, and you know, that must be a very tough thing to have to see when you look at your house and it's being looted and being you know, plundered by an invading force. So what, you know, what kind of violence and you know, warlike things were happening to people?
Saeed, is it okay if I take this? Do you mind?
Please, go ahead.
Okay. I think one of the ways to think about this is the following, that it occurs in stages. So, you know, again, we focus a lot on May of 48, right? But the reality is, by the time the state of Israel is declared, there's already 400,000 Palestinian refugees and this internally displaced people, right? So there's a process that unfolds here from November of 1947. So why November of 47, right? That is when the UN partition plan for Palestine is approved by the General Assembly. Now, we can have a whole discussion about the legality of that, right? But at a basic level, and I think this is Victor Catan is someone who's written a lot about this, about the legality of the UN General Assembly developing a plan when this is outside the responsibilities of the General Assembly. This is, again, not what the General Assembly should be doing. And the fact that that partition plan passes, right, which is unexpected. And again, it takes us back to the 5 points I made earlier. Where was the Palestinian Arab leadership? Where was the Arab leadership and their failings when it comes to the partition plan passing unexpectedly, right? And then fighting that breaks out immediately after the partition plan comes through. So you're going to have fighting between what becomes, the pre-state Zionist militias, the Haganah, the terrorist groups, the Stern Gang, and the Irgun, as well as these Arab militias, Palestinian Arab militias, right? Now they are, especially on the Palestinian Arab side, are not well trained, unlike the Zionist militias, and there's a number of reasons for that. They're also outgunned, and there are not as many of them, right? So again, this takes us back to the Mandate period. What were the British authorities doing, especially before and during World War II, to help prepare the Zionist militias in the event of a Nazi invasion during World War II? How was that then transformed into what became the pre-state militias, then developed into what now becomes the Israel Defense Forces by May 1948? But also a very specific decision that's made by the Haganah military. So this is the main militia, right? The largest Zionist militia in Palestine. What becomes known as Plan D, right? And Plan D is a very specific decision by the Haganah, which is the following: that according to the UN partition plan, and you can show some maps with this. So for those who are familiar with the map of Palestine, Palestine is supposed to be divided into this hourglass partition between a majority Arab state and a majority Jewish state, okay? They were never supposed to be purely homogenous, by the way, because the population disparity was huge, right? There's 1.2, 1.3 million Palestinian Arabs by 1947, 1948, and about 650,000 Palestinian Jews, right, from the Zionist movement. What eventually happens is that the Haganah is going to decide in roughly March of 48 that they're going to launch what they call Plan D. And this is to cleanse, as they will put it, right, to empty the area allotted for the Jewish majority state of its Arab residents, right? So this is an active policy, what we would now call ethnic cleansing, right? But an active policy of depopulating this area, okay? And they're going to target several things. Very strategic areas. So a village, for example, like Deir Yassin, which is attacked in April 48, but also the major population centers of Arabs, Haifa, Jaffa, Safed, Taiba, will all be hit. Now, what's some horrifying reading, quite frankly, is in the British archives, because the British, as they are preparing to leave Palestine, to end the mandate by May of 48, they have a hard date when they're leaving. There are reports coming in to London, for example, from these different cities. We're getting reports that Safed is being depopulated. We're getting reports that Taiba has lost all of its Arab residents. And the British authorities will say there's no way this is true. This can't possibly be true. They will discount it, of course. They will say the Arabs are exaggerating. The Arabs are trying to get attention. And they will eventually send someone out from one of the colonial officials out to investigate. And they will see that, there's a huge number of refugees, right? The cities are empty. We have cases where houses have been abandoned. The food is still being cooked, people running for their lives effectively. And part of this has to do with a very effective campaign, both of specific targeting. Okay. So in the case of Deir Yassin, where you had a village that had already signed a non-aggression pact with the neighboring kibbutz, and it's attacked because of its strategic location. And this is a case where you have 250 Palestinian Arabs, men, women, and children who are killed. Women are raped. And the news of that is going to spread in several different channels. So there's also this terror campaign that kicks in, right? Part of it is the Irgun and the Stern Gang, who carried out the Deir Yassin massacre, will then go and repeat their claims, right, on loudspeakers. They'll come to another village and they'll say, if you want to happen what happened in Deir Yassin, this is what happened. We raped the women, we did this, etc. And this will cause panic, right? At the same time, word itself spreads through Arab media and word of mouth. And of course, like with anything, when you get a panic that kicks in, it becomes escalated. And as we see in the major urban areas, Haifa, Taiba, there was specific targeting of these population centers, right, to ensure flight. So some people are going to flee for their lives, as you would in any kind of conflict situation. And some people will be forced to flee at gunpoint. And others will flee in advance of an advancing column, right? So what we see, to Saeed's point, is anywhere from 400 to 700 villages will be completely depopulated. And then over the next few years, right, after the State of Israel is declared, that there will be an attempt to, one, repopulate them with Jews from Europe who were displaced during World War II. Some will be just covered over. You know, these are empty villages that are never repopulated, become now national parks, in which they will plant trees that, like cedar trees, things like this, that are not even native to the soil, but in an attempt to cover the crime that was committed there effectively. This is just some of what goes on, but I think it's important for you know, those who are watching to understand that even before May of 48, there are already anywhere between 400,000 roughly Palestinian refugees and internally displaced people who have now been, you know, pushed into either neighboring Arab countries, Iraq, Syria, but also into Gaza eventually. It's now Gaza, into the West Bank, and eventually into Jordan. Saeed, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to add, Muhammad and Osamah, a couple of things. Look, Israel would not have been created without British colonialism, and that idea was germinating in the 19th century. I mean, it's, if you go back to Balfour's dad and Churchill's dad and so on, you'll find them basically conspiring to do this, that culminated in the Balfour Declaration and so on. This mandate was a very violent colonial project. So it came into Palestine with the intent of decimating the public. And in fact, if we look at the history, you know, in the 20s, we will find that the British Army and security forces' brutality against the Palestinians, it knew no bounds, you know, knew no bounds. In the 30s, in the early 30s, if we look back at the history, we find that someone like General Wingate, for instance, a British general, racist criminal, he basically taught the Zionist terrorists at the time how to kill Arabs and feel, you know, nothing about it, go into the village and kill them and so on. Moshe Dayan himself, you know, one time said that you see all these villages, you see all these places, every place had a Palestinian town and so on. So, you know, this whole history is based and predicated on violence against the Palestinians that still goes on. I mean, the massacres that were committed, of course, you know, Deir Yassin is probably well known and the world may know about it and so on. But in fact, there were many, many other massacres that took place. Look at what the British did during the Palestinian revolt, 36 to 39. They decimated the ability of the Palestinians to resist and fight you know, such a criminal aggression against their patrimony. You know, the Palestinians were peasants. They were peasants, and they fought heroically. You know, they may not have fought in an organized fashion or as an army, but they did defend their villages and their places and their farms. And but you have to remember, if a Palestinian was caught with a rifle, he would be sentenced to death by the British. Remember that. While in fact they were arming the Zionists to the teeth, giving them, you know, automatic weapons, giving them artillery, giving them airplanes, and giving them volunteers to fly these airplanes. That's why it is laughable. You know, when you look at what they say, 7 Arab armies came into and all this thing and so on. You know, you had close to 100,000 soldiers armed to the teeth, aided by the British, aided by the French, aided by the American, with American airplanes. And, you know, some had the B-47, which was like the most amazing airplane and so on. While the Arabs, in fact, collectively, you know, those who went in to Palestine were under 30,000. They were ill-armed. They were basically all controlled by colonial powers. Remember that. Everybody talks about, you know, the defected arms, for instance, in Egypt, you know, and the Egyptian army and so on. So this whole thing, you know, the whole idea of the creation of Israel is basically to create, you know, a colonial Western base, you know, in that Arab world, you know, future designs, and so on. And remember, I mean, people tell you the Jews have immigrated and this and so on and all. Remember that the founders of Israel were basically all Ashkenazi Jews. They were all Ashkenazi Jews, mainly, maybe some were not, but mainly were Ashkenazi Jews. And they have always played, on the part of racism, their own racism and so on, to depopulate the Palestinians. In fact, that's what we saw with Safkat al-Qarn, the deal of the century. I mean, I'm always amazed or, amused, I should say, by what they say, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and this is basically a racist term that was coined by Abba Eban, I mean, of course, Jared Kushner parodied out during the release of the deal of the century, but in fact, Abba Eban said the Arabs never miss an opportunity, but he was wrong, because the Arabs have always, as we have seen, culminating with the Camp David Accord agreement with Egypt, and then after that with Jordan, and so on. And there was never a deal. Anyone that tells you that, let's say, the Americans tried to offer the Palestinians something, is just malarkey. It is nonsense, because there was not, I mean, I've been covering this issue for a very, very long time. There was nothing ever offered to the Palestinians before Oslo or after Oslo. Or after Oslo, there were, some sort of lip service promises and so on that you will have a state by 1999 and so on, which never happened. There's talk about the Clinton plans that, the Clinton plans, they came out right before Clinton left office. So it is all nonsensical. And that's why the two-state solution is completely nonsensical and completely an illusion and completely false in coming into realization. So I just want to say that if you look at this history, if you look at the history of the Nakba, if you look at the history of the Zionist movement, if you look at the history of the occupation, you will come to the conclusion that Israel cannot reconcile itself to some sort of a Palestinian national entity that is sovereign, that is independent, that can, in one way or another, bring in the Palestinian refugees back. It can never accept the fact that the world has decided long ago that the Palestinian refugees must return. It will not even allow maybe a fraction of those territories. So the conflict is determined by the victor, in this case, Israel. But the upside of this, that the Palestinians today, between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, are actually a larger population than Jewish Israelis. If you look at their numbers, we'll probably exceed them by 200,000. So the point is, this is not something, demographic. I'm not a fan of the demographic card and so on. But the reality is, when you say that the Palestinians are there, and they are there in the millions of numbers, that tells you that they have not been defeated. That tells you that they can go on to struggle another day. They can go on to struggle for human rights, for civil rights, for a country that is equal to and democratic for all its citizens. Thank you.
I think this is a good transition point, because we've talked up until May 48. So this is, I think, one of the points I'm humming to think about, taking us back to your original question, which is, how did this happen? So it doesn't begin in May of 48, and it doesn't end in May of 48, right? So to keep in mind that the Nakba then now continues as an actual event, right? So this actual event of the destruction of Palestine, right, now continues well into from 48 into 49, 1950, right? Because to Saeed's point, and for the once the state of Israel is declared, right? And of course, we know this general narrative, to Saeed's point, about the 7 Arab armies that invade, et cetera. And what's not talked about often in this narrative, right, is that side deals had already been cut and had already been negotiated, again, to Saeed's point about the role of the British, between the British and Jordan, for example, and the Zionist movement. And so it's actually when the Jordanian army enters borders of Palestine, is to secure that territory, again, taking us back to the partition plan, then with their Iraqi allies, is there to secure the territory allotted for the Arab state, right? When we divide Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, to secure that area and bring it into Jordan, which is exactly what happens, right? And so what we actually have is between these quote unquote 7 Arab armies is, in the case of the Lebanese and Syrian armies, it's like they're basically contingents. They're very small. They have either poorly led or very few armaments, and they're quickly defeated. The Iraqi and Jordanian contingents don't fight effectively, right? They're there to seize that territory. They're there to seize the West Bank, okay, which is what they do. The Egyptian army is out on its own, right? And in fact, the Egyptian army actually breaks ranks, doesn't perform well for a number of reasons. And I think one of the key things here to think about is the following, is that we had about 400,000 refugees up through May 48. You get another 300 to 400,000 after May of 48, right? And these, in some cases, become refugees for the second or third time. Many of these will end up in what is now Jordan, some in the West Bank, some in Jordan, some will go into Syria again. You get the depopulation of the Galilee, right? The targeting of the major cities in the Galilee. Those Palestinians will end up in Lebanon. And so that will occur through the rest of 48, into the fall of 48, into 49. And in fact, we still have some depopulation going on in and around the northern West Bank, villages near what's now near Tulkarm and Kalkili that will go on into 49 and 50. And so then there's the other aspect, right? Because to Saeed's point, we've talked about the one UN General Assembly resolution, right? For the partition of Palestine. There's the second one, which now again in 1948, which says that Palestinian refugees have the right of return to their lands like any refugee does, and compensation for their losses. And this is one that has never been implemented. And in fact, the Israelis had very quickly determined that they were not going to have anything to do with the return. Once they had cleansed these areas, ethnically cleansed these areas and depopulated these areas, right? That we have what they called a retroactive transfer policy. In other words, and this is as early as May of 48, late May of 48, so about 2 weeks after the declaration of the State of Israel, we have a retroactive transfer policy that's implemented. And it's quite simply, those who've left cannot return, right? Those who have left, those Palestinian Arabs who have left cannot return. Now, some will sneak back in over the next 2 years, right? But those who've left cannot return. And all of this will culminate into, by 1950, the absentee land policy, right? Which is effectively the state is going to seize any land in which the owners are no longer there, okay? So we have a process here of effectively institutionalizing, legalizing the Nakba, right? And that's one way to think about this. So you have a retroactive transfer policy which forbids their return regardless of international law, regardless of what the UN General Assembly may call for, right? And then internal Israeli legal policies that are then meant to basically seize any property, any assets those individuals may have had.
And Dr. Osamah, by the way, so because my family, they're originally, my grandparents fled in 1948
right.
From the Galilee, from the north of Palestine.
Yeah.
And one of my great uncles, he actually, he was one of those that you said snuck back in. So
right.
He fled to Lebanon and then went back to the village. But because of all of the intimidation and just the danger that was subjected to the family, he then ended up going back to Lebanon again because it was just too dangerous.
Right.
Right. And I think people don't know about these details, these small details, but very important ones.
Oh, there's lots of stories like this. Some people will sneak back in and will stay. Some people will come back and realize that there's nothing for them to come back to, right? Or there's nothing for them. It's difficult to come back. And one of the things that I think we also, and I'm sure I can see, I'm going to turn over to Saeed, but keep in mind also, majority Arab areas, especially in the Galilee, were then put under martial law for the next almost 20 years, right, by Israel. So, people who are sneaking back in, you're sneaking back into an area under martial law. And so when we think about what martial law is, so keep in mind, I also want to take a step back as a historian and make a couple of points, which is this. How do we know these things? So what's interesting is this, and it's telling, because this takes us back to this point Saeed was making about some of these mythical narratives, the Abba Iban quotes, the quotes about the 7 Arab armies, the 22 Arab states, all of these great quotes that some of us have heard You know, when you get to my age and Saeed's age, we've heard these for years, right? As a historian, you hear them in a range of places. But one of the things to keep in mind is Arab writers at the time were writing about this. And of course, it was always dismissed as conspiracy. This is all conspiracy theory. The collusion between King Abdullah of Jordan and the Zionist movement was dismissed as conspiracy theory, right? Up until what? So as a historian, one of the things we try and do is we go back to state archives and we look for the state to declassify a number of these materials. And lo and behold, so I talked a little bit about what you would find in the British archives, these reports back from Palestine. Now keep in mind, I think this is an important point on the anniversary of the Nakba to keep this in mind. For years, we're not talking about 1 or 2 years, decades, in the United States, there was always this discounting of the Palestinian refugees. The numbers are inflated. There were never that many. They didn't exist. This is the famous golden age. They didn't exist. They were never there, right? The land was empty, right? The houses didn't exist. The people didn't exist. They were never there. There were never any refugees. And what's amazing about this very polemical narrative that was often accepted as fact, right, is when you go back through, for instance, the U.S. archives, the British archives, they sit back, they've documented, right? This is State Department, this is the British Foreign Office, all documenting. They know how many Arabs became refugees. They know where they were from. They know the villages. They know the towns they're from. They knew how many Palestinians. In fact, they were negotiating with many of these same individuals who then became refugees, right? During the mandate period. So this is not this was not some mystery. In fact, what's amazing about this is all of this has been known for decades, right? Even before some of these archives were open and declassified. Or when did this finally become accepted? It became accepted when the Israeli archives were finally open in the 80s and was written about by Israeli historians, right? And this caused, as you can imagine, within Israeli society, and it still does. This issue of the Nakba. To take us back to your question, Mohammed, this issue of the Nakba still creates all of this anxiety, right? Even among quote unquote leftist Israelis. Why? Because for many of them, they have this dream about the beautiful Israel that was created in 48, right? This home after the Holocaust for Jews from around the world to come to, that was then ruined, they believe, after this 1967 war and the occupation, right? That the occupation is when Israel turned back. So going back and looking at what happened in 48 is kind of exposing, as one historian, Zachary Lockman, has written, the original sin, right? And how Israel was created basically on top of another society, a society that was destroyed, right?
Well, and to touch on what you just said, the denial of the existence of Palestinian refugees, if you think about it, is very similar to the denial of the Holocaust. It's basically the same thing,
Well, and it's here's what's similar about it. That this is all very well documented, right? Okay, but in both cases, it's very well documented, right? And so to deny it is basically to deny just basic facts. It's like denying that there's oxygen, right? So I think what you want to think about is, and also recognizing that in both cases, that denial is politically motivated. It's politically driven. It's ideologically driven, right? So without ever, we don't have to compare these two to somehow legitimize the Nakba. We know what the Nakba was, right? And it's been well documented. And we know what the Holocaust was, and it was well documented, right? And there is a link between the two, right? In that, as we know, in the 1930s, for example, to take us back to the British Mandate, and I think this is where it becomes an important link, is that Zionism itself was a failing movement. The Zionist settler movement, the colonial movement itself, was failing, right, up until the 1930s. And what we start to see, right, is, of course, this mass immigration that's connected to the rise of Nazi Germany, the anti-Semitic laws that are passed, and the fleeing, right, of Jews from Europe. Now, at the same time, we also know that there were anti-Semitic immigration laws and policies that were instituted in Europe and in the United States that actually prevented Jews from fleeing. And so where are they going to go, right? And so many of them will go to Palestine. And this is going to add into already the displacement that's going on there that dates back to the origins of the Zionism, the displacement of many Palestinian peasants. But I think what's the more important aspect here to come back to, Muhammad, is this, which is we know these facts, right? They've been denied for a long time. And we know a lot of the polemics that are thrown out. And I think it's important for us to get past that and say, okay, how do we recognize these polemics and how are they then being recreated today, right? With things like the deal of the century and this active denial of Palestinian nationalism, because that's actually this denial of the refugees, the denial of the existence of Palestinians is at its core also a denial of Palestinian humanity.
And that's a very important subject today with everything going on politically as it relates to the Palestinian issue. So it would be great if you could touch on, Saeed, if you could please, I know that you have a lot of experience with the State Department and the diplomats and everything. How does that all play today?
It's a very good and a very interesting question. Let's keep in mind, really, that the United States have always been supportive of Israel and Israeli excesses. There are probably maybe one or two exceptions in history, like the 1956 war, when they said, look, you know, the better pull out of Sinai. They threatened the British and the French during the tripartite aggression on Egypt. Also, maybe during the 73 war, when Nixon and Kissinger said, look, if you don't let loose of if you don't break your siege of the Egyptian Third Army, we might cut off aid and so on. So with these two exceptions, there's been really a sort of not only very supportive, complicit, with Israeli, complicit U.S. policy with Israeli aggression and so on. Although if we want to go back a little bit in history, we can go to the King Crane Commission of 1919, which came back and said, look, it was in response to the Balfour Declaration, and they said, look, this area is populated, has villages, has populations, has all these things, it's thriving, doing all these things and so on. And in fact, they were a bit leery of the creation of a Jewish patrimony in Palestine at the time. But going back to your question, the United States was the first country to recognize Israel, right? So it was the first country. It withheld maybe military aid to Israel for a while, but it became an exclusive supplier of military aid after the 1967 war, which that tells you that the U.S. has been supportive of this aggression and occupation. I mean, let's remember, if Jordan is, and in fact remains today, they claim, one of its staunchest allies in the region, then why accept that Jordan would, give up the West Bank, for instance, and for no reason? They did not. Why would the United States agree to let's say, to the interpretation of 242, which calls on Israel to withdraw from occupied territories, that they have done so, as we have seen in the deal of the century? This has been going on all along. But during all the past time, directly to your question, Muhammad, during all the past years, since the late 40s and on through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and until this administration, there was always an interest, there was always experts, and there were always experts that are focused and knowledgeable, and they know the region, they know the conflict. You can reach out to them. They have, they have some knowledgeable, although, politically motivated and political motivation behind U.S. policy towards Israel, but at least there was something of substance in the State Department. With this administration, this ceased to exist. It's no longer there. In fact, the bureaus that were there now have been reduced to basically no personnel whatsoever that look after these issues. We have seen with Tillerson, we saw the last hurrah with the previous administration, with the Obama administration, with Kerry. Remember when he had this 9-month gestation negotiation plan? I mean, I don't know what the thing behind the 9 months was, and he sent in Martin Indyk to negotiate for the Palestinians. Brought in Makovsky, who worked for an APAC front, which is WINIP, the Washington Institute of Near East Policy, and he basically put the map. David Makovsky plays the maps, which includes the so-called settlement blocks, including the settlement blocks, which basically most of, all of Jerusalem, all the big settlements, include Ma'ali Adumim and all these things, and Hebron, and so on. So that was their last try. That was their last effort at negotiation. With the election of this administration, when Tillerson became Secretary of State, he absolutely did no effort whatsoever on the Palestinian issue. It was left to the White House. And in fact, when Pompeo came, it was the same thing. Pompeo did not do anything, or his State Department would not interfere. I mean, I would go day after day and ask questions, and they say, well, the White House is looking after the Middle East peace process. That's what they call it, after the peace process. And it became a euphemism to the conflict, the peace process. The White House is doing it. In other words, Kushner and Jason Greenblatt and David Friedman, who are basically settlers. I mean, we have to remember that the Kushner family contributes heavily to the Beit Il, the settlement. They contributed maybe $18 million, $20 million, and so on over the years, maybe more. The same thing with Jason Greenblatt. He was always supportive of the settlement. He's the guy that says we should not call them settlement because that has some sort of a negative connotation. We should call them neighborhoods. He called it neighborhood. And then, of course, Friedman is the guy that's designing policy. He sits on the board of Beit Il, for instance. He's the guy that just last week said, he says, you cannot ask the Jews to leave Hebron, asking them to leave Hebron. I mean, he was drawing these crazy analogies and so on. So keep that in mind. This State Department in particular has basically, forfeited policymaking to a group of zealots, and I call them a group of zealots because that's what they are. And they are constricted to one point of view. They're the ones that basically drafted and released and so on the so-called deal of the century. I'm almost certain. I don't want to say nothing is 100% certain, but I'm inclined to believe that it was basically Netanyahu and the Likud that drafted this deal of the century. So and then they came and adopted it and so on. So it was Pompeo who came in a couple of weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, responded to my question, as a matter of fact, and said, well, Israel can do whatever it wants with it. That's an Israeli issue, the annexation. Basically,
yeah. And it's mind-boggling that you have a group of people like that in charge of negotiations when they should be unbiased, but obviously there's a severe bias there. Yeah. So that's what's mind-boggling to me.
Right. Well, let me remind you what Aaron Miller said. And he called Dennis Ross Israel's lawyer.
He said the U.S. was Israel's attorney.
Those guys, if you look at the makeup of the American team during the Clinton administration and so on, you will find that they all either came or worked at one point or another for AIPAC and so on, including Martin Indyk, including Dennis Ross, including many others. And Dennis Ross, and to this day, he acts and writes and so on as Israel's lawyer. Even most recently, he basically wrote an article a few days ago about how Israel should do the annexation, rather than saying this is really, we stand against it, we negotiated against it, we did the maps and so on, which they did. They created maps in their shop, at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. So in a nutshell, U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy has always favored Israel, will continue to favor Israel. When they keep saying time and time and time again that the bond will never be broken and so on, it is true. It is true. It sees Israel as an extension of its own, makeup and political orientation and so on. There's a great deal of connections between zealous Zionists and or Likudniks or fundamentalists, Jewish fundamentalists and Christian fundamentalists. I mean, that's why we see this, rub my back and I rub your back kind of thing. But, in 3 words, the U.S. State Department has not been the kind of, this complex of U.S. foreign policy that really looks at U.S. interest in the long term. Perhaps in the short term, it's been beneficial for them, but in the long term, it's not.
Look, I want to take that. Hang on.
Oh yeah,
can I jump in
ahead,
here?
Dr. Osamah.
Yeah, I want to jump in here because I want to take this back to the Nakba and then and kind of follow a logical thought here. You know, we have a tendency to look at the Trump administration and its actions, and we should, but I think we have to put this in a longer continuum. So taking us back to, for example, the creation of UNRWA, right, the UN Relief and Works Agency, which was created to deal with the Palestinian refugees, right? And it's created in 1950, but very quickly after it's created, right, the State Department and the Truman administration decide a few things, right? So the Truman administration from about 49, 50 is putting pressure on Israel to repatriate some 250,000 Palestinian refugees. And one of the things that they're running into is kind of they're stuck in between two things. The Arab states, which are saying 250,000 is not enough, right? They all need to go back, right? There's a UN General Assembly resolution. And the Israelis are saying there's no way we're taking 250,000 back, right? Maybe if you're lucky, we'll take 100,000, maybe, right? But the Israelis want something in return. And eventually by 1950, it's very quick, right after Israel gets entry into it gets what it wants, which is it gets entry into the UN as a member state, all those negotiations go out the window. And the Truman administration changes tack. And so what we see is even by 52, they're doing two things. They've given up on any large-scale repatriation. And in fact, what they're telling UNRWA is that the money we're giving you needs to be devoted towards resettlement of the refugees where they are. And so there's going to be this constant tension with UNRWA over the next several decades, right, in which pro-Israel members of Congress want to cut off funding to UNRWA, and in which the State Department will say, we need to maintain it because the refugees can be a destabilizing force, a source for the Soviet Union to create trouble in the region, right? But slowly we can start to reduce the amount of money we're giving UNRWA as resettlement occurs in the Arab states, right? Or as the refugees die off. And so what we've also seen over the decades is, of course, Israel's influence in trying to change who the refugees are, what the refugees are. And so, you know, there's a great piece that's published by Dalal Yassin on the New Arab, for those who are interested in looking at what's happened just the past decade, how the U.S. has tried to the U.S. and Israel have targeted UNRWA, trying to change how it defines a refugee, targeted its funding, wanting to erase the refugees and erase UNRWA. And I highly recommend those who are watching to read it. But at the same time, to Saeed's point, we have this, which is that the Trump administration did not just create some of these issues out of nothing. We have several different lines of negotiation that have occurred over the past 2.5 decades, right? And that includes concessions by the Palestinian leadership, particularly on the refugees, okay? One, because they're under pressure from the United States and from Israel to accept reality, right? All the refugees are not going to return, right? And in fact, we had that in some memos by individuals like Saad Barakat, you know, et cetera, the chief negotiator, saying, we understand that not all the refugees can go back, right? Let's look for a symbolic return of refugees. And then trying to trade off compensation for return, and what does return mean? So some of this dates back to Saeed's point, back to the Oslo negotiations, right? Back in the 1990s into 2000, through the Bush administration, into the Obama administration, and now Trump. I think it's also important to remember the following, that, you know, we can focus on, and Saeed is absolutely right. You have, whether it's Kushner, Greenblatt, or Friedman, you have an ideological line that is direct between the settler movement in Israel and key members of the Trump administration, right? But we also saw that with the Bush administration, and we see elements of that, as much as they deny it, right, with individuals at the Washington Institute, those like Martin Indyke, Dennis Ross especially, who have over and over again, their influence on the peace process has been profound. And let's not forget, what were some of the early proposals and the consistent proposals? So Saeed, when we talk about, for example, what was a Palestinian state supposed to look like, even in the best case scenario, 90-some% of the West Bank, right, connected to Gaza through some kind of land bridge.
Land swaps.
And then land swaps, right? So the settlements were not going to be dismantled. There was going to be land swaps, right? So, Of course, Dennis Ross is now writing, yes, let's figure out how to do the annexation, because this is exactly what they were thinking back in the 1990s. Mali Adumin, Ariel, they were never going to be dismantled, right? This was not going to be a recreation. So for the people who are watching, they're thinking, well, why would they dismantle settlements? Because this was the precedent set in Camp David with Egypt, right? So the precedent set with Camp David and Egypt was the following: the Camp David and the subsequent peace agreement with Egypt in 1978 and 1979 was the following: full withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, dismantlement of settlements, and full diplomatic relations between Egypt and Israel, right? So that precedent was set, okay? However, what we've seen has been this attempt to negotiate, mitigate not only some of the key UN Security Council resolutions and the key frameworks of land for peace in the negotiation of what will become a Palestinian state, but also an attempt to kind of manipulate. So, for example, we talk about annexation of the Jordan Valley. Saeed, you remember what was in Camp David in the 1990s and the Oslo negotiations? What were they going to do with the Jordan Valley? Do you remember this proposal?
Yes, absolutely.
Remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
They're going to do a 99-year lease on the Jordan Valley, right? So Israel was going to maintain its bases, right, and maintain its military controlling the Jordan Valley for a quote-unquote 99-year lease, all right? That was one of the proposals, and the one that was as close. We always hear about, and Saeed made this point about Camp David in 2000, the great deal that was offered, and then it turns out nothing was actually offered. But in those negotiations, in the negotiations that were going on, one of the proposals on the table was this: 99-year lease of the Jordan Valley, right? And that was not something, quote unquote, at the time that the Palestinian leadership objected to. So they've given away several concessions that have now come back over and over again to haunt them, right? And to haunt the Palestinians.
Yeah. Well, I just want to add on the issue of the Jordan Valley. Remember, the Jordan Valley is 28% of the West Bank.
Yeah.
So that makes it 28% of the 22%.
Right.
Okay. When you add the settlements and so on, basically what they are willing to, whatever, give some sort of a Palestinian entity, provided that the Palestinians behave for a number of years, 10 and so on, and prove that they are worthy of that. Right. Is basically on 60% of the 22%, 60% of the West Bank. So keep those figures in mind when you look at what America has done under its its husbanding of this or shepherding of this process, and they feel that the moment has come. I mean, if you look at the deal of the century, there are things in it that are really amazing and reflect the thinking. When they say Israel in a defensive war took these in 1967 took all these things, right. And Israel has returned 88% of the land conquered in 1967. I mean, those were the exact words. So they're saying, oh my God, Israel is so generous. It has already given back, which no other country has done anything similar like this in history. So when we say the Nakba still goes on, the Nakba really still goes on. It still goes on. Palestinians are still being displaced. They are being ethnically cleansed. They're being assassinated. They're being killed. They're being, besieged and so on. More. There are Palestinian Israelis who are still under this crazy notion of present absentee. Yeah. There is something called present absentee. There are hundreds of thousands of refugees today that are in 1948 Palestine, that are dislocated, removed from their villages, have no status, and so on. So the point is that what we should keep in mind is that Israel was created with the premise that Palestine was a land without people, and they are people without land. In other words, they want to deny your existence. This still goes on today. They want to deny your existence. If you look at all the discussion all throughout the campaigns of for over a year, for this for the, 3 elections in 1 year and so on, the Palestinian issue or the occupied or the occupation is never discussed. It's never discussed because they want to wish the Palestinians away and the Palestinian issue away because they see it in their mind as their antithesis, their antithesis. They see it as, the existence of this group somehow necessarily denies our existence. Those are the basic elements of the conflict that unfortunately still go on. Now, how do we move forward? I say that if the two-state solution has collapsed, I mean, one thing about the deal of the century proved that this idea is dead. I mean, it's dead and buried and good riddance, okay? So what we need to do is move forward and begin a process of discussion on how we go about struggling for a binational state, one state where people live, with equal rights, equal obligations, and so on under one law. Now, the Israelis may not like this because it will take away their privilege, but you can't have your cake and eat it too at the same time. Either you coexist with the Palestinians, or we must look together for a different solution.
So I think that's a great point, Said. I want to pick up on it just a little bit to take us back.
Speak up.
I want to take us back a little bit because, Said makes an excellent point when we think about this discussion of annexation, all right, and the role of, we can talk about the percentages of the land, but I think an important way to think about is that Israel's policy, what it has tried to do since 1967, as a continuation of 48, right? Talking about this continuation of the Nakba, is the greatest amount of land with the least amount of Palestinians on it, all right? And so, for example, Said, when you look at the annexation proposals, the seizure of these large settlement blocks, it's very similar to the Allon plan that takes us back, way back to the beginning of the occupation, right? And so what we can see, and this also takes us back.
This is the Allon plan.
Yeah, this is, right. Think about this continuation, this continual process. Now, remember, Allon was in the Labor Party, right? So we could talk all about these connections between Netanyahu and the Likud and the Trump administration or the Bush administration, right? But what we know is that the settlement project has been a joint Labor-Likud project. We also know that this takes us right back to the very beginnings, where we began this conversation, all right? Where we began the conversation, the role of the Zionist movement, its ideology, and its policies. And so we can see over and over again this continual process of the Nakba, not just as this historical moment, but as a historical process that continues today. And it's linked to the Zionist movement's ideology of displacement, dispossession, and erasure. And we can see that again with this annexation proposal, right? But at the same time, what we can't ignore is that, to Said's point, Palestinians are still there. We are still there. We remain there, right? And so now, how do we start to move toward this, now that it's been fully exposed, the fallacy of the two-state solution, right? How do we start to move towards equal rights, politically, civil rights, religious rights? We know, for example, that any negotiations over two states is just going to be an attempt to negate those rights, right? So how do we now start to move toward a full rights for everyone in a way that we have not talked about for some time?
And the whole question of two state, one state, but let's assume by some magical reason, which is not going to happen, that there is going to be a two-state solution.
Yeah, but I don't even think we should talk about it because it's just not going to happen. I mean, we've wasted. I know in D.C., and I don't want to interrupt, but I know in D.C. Look, I want to make this point really clear, especially because in D.C. what this has become, and Said just made a great point. The two-state solution has become basically a jobs program. When we think about FDR, Said, and the jobs program, right? This has become a jobs program for failed diplomats, right? For DC think tanks.
Cottage industry.
Right, it's an entire cottage industry, and for who, right? So think about who it employs. It employs DC think tanks. Okay, it employs former people who call themselves negotiators, right? What you wonder what negotiation these people conducted over 25 years, right? And the various failed initiatives, okay, that they've been involved in, okay, and that's just on the Palestinian side. One failure after the next, and yet what gives them some kind of expertise? What gives them a place at the table? Oh, I was involved in a negotiation. The two-state solution was never going to happen. This is a jobs program for DC, for former failed diplomats, and for think tanks all of which have ties back to the State Department. And of course, for former Palestinian negotiators who no longer have a job or a position with the Sultan and are now looking for something to give them a reason to go make talks and to get some media attention. They have nothing to offer. In fact, when you read anything that they write, anything, right, it's basically empty. They have no new ideas. They didn't have any ideas they brought to the negotiating table. When you look at, here's one of the great things. As a historian, when we go look at some of these, their papers, the negotiating papers, you realize how empty their proposals are, right? So I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think we've wasted how many years now, Saeed? 40 years, right? Talking about this. Yeah. We've wasted 40 years talking about this.
Process in 1991, that's for sure.
Okay. I mean, it's enough, all right? 40 years. At some point, we can sit back and say, look, we got it. It's not going to happen. So what are we going to do now? The two-state solution, it's out. It's over. And think about it. You have to remember something, Mohammed, and to the audience, and not to get and not to make too much of a point of this, but remember how much of a concession this was by the Palestinians, by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, right? Remember, Saeed, you remember, right, when Arafat made the major concession, right? So when Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO, made the major concession, accepting a two-state solution, okay? And what happened with that instead of that concession being accepted, was that the PLO was then turned into a local police force, right, to then police the West Bank and Gaza, and as a way of erasing and separating Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza from Palestinians in Jerusalem, from Palestinians inside Israel, and from Palestinians in the refugee camps in Jordan and Syria. And they were completely abandoned, right? So let's be clear about what the two-state solution, whatever it was meant to be, that did not happen, and it's not going to happen. So now it's time, I think, to move forward. And this is the time, I would say, in 2020, where we can finally put that to bed, right? And now let's start thinking about where do we go from here. So it's not worth talking about what would this look like, what will it be, and it's just not worth it. It's not worth the time we've wasted on it.
And my point was specifically about that is, again, like hypothetically, if that was a possibility, which obviously
go ahead.
But what about the people, for example, like my family, who came from villages and towns in what is now present-day Israel?
Yeah.
What would happen to them in a two-state solution? So they're out of luck. They can't go back to their homes. So it's just not fair for the people that fled from 1948.
So the way
can I just chime in, Osamah?
Go ahead, Said.
On this point, I just want to chime in. Yeah, I mean that is really the big elephant in the room, the Palestinian refugee issue. I mean, there are some maybe 6.5 million Palestinian refugees. What are you going to do with them? I mean, their situation has to be resolved, and it has to be resolved in the most fundamental of ways, that their right be restored, which is the right of return. It is fundamental. So any state or any solution that does not include the return of the Palestinian refugees to their homeland, their villages, is unworkable. Nobody will accept it. It will die. It's dead on arrival, okay? And I can not understand, but I see what, let's say, the Zionists try to do. I mean, remember, the reason Trump cut off aid to UNRWA, because they think that UNRWA perpetuates the refugee issue. And if you cut off funding, then, people will forget about the refugees. Let's treat the Palestinian refugees.
They'll stop thinking they're refugees, right?
Right. They're like everybody else. And it was an idea that was that incubated where? At FDD, another front for Israel. The Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. They're the ones, people like.
But this, I
don't want to mention
is
names.
well before this is well before FDD. FDD took this, and this is something we can go back to the 1960s. Right. They were talking about defunding, and in fact, with support from who?
But let me just finish my point, Osamah. Yeah. They went and they convinced this administration, because it's liking, that Palestinian refugees are only about maybe 30,000. That their those who are still alive, They're about 30, 40,000. That is manageable.
Yeah.
This is a manageable issue. But, you cannot have a two-state solution that does not bring back Palestinian refugees, that does not manage to implement, UN Resolution 194, to bring the Palestinians back. It will fail. It will fail. The Palestinians will not support it. They can support it maybe or not. I'm saying certain Palestinians may support it through a different, a particular time frame. But in reality, it is no solution. It will only perpetuate the problem. I think that's where I agree with Osamah. I think it's time to drop this illusion, and move on. Begin to create ways. Begin to assure Israelis and Jewish Israelis that we want to live with them. We want to live as equal citizens in the same land. We want to deal with our issues collectively. We will have differences like most other peoples and so on. We will have great differences. This is not something easy to achieve overnight, but we have to begin a process of thinking seriously and discard the other alternatives. I'm not saying that the PA ought to dismantle itself overnight, but the PA for sure, the Palestinian Authority for sure, must seize all agreements of coordination with the Israelis. It must seize it. It must end it. I mean, they're going to meet tomorrow, allegedly, to deal with the issue of annexation. Point one, and Martin Indyk, to his credit, Osamah, the other day on a panel that I was also attending, on Zoom, he basically asked the Shtaya, and he says, look, you guys threaten all the time, but are you going to do it? When are you going to end this shameful security coordination? Because I tell you what, the security coordination means that the Palestinian Authority must aid the Israeli occupation, and not the other way around. When was the last time, and this would be my last point, when was the last time a Palestinian security force went into the settlement to grab some criminal who killed the Palestinians? That never happened. So security coordination means one thing and one thing only, that the facilitation of this occupation to continue.
So look, I want to jump on this point because I think it's an important point to make. Let's there's a lot of speculation, and I wrote about this many years ago, right? And I've stopped writing about it. Why? About when is the PA going to dissolve itself? When is the PA going to? The PA will never dissolve itself. The Palestinian Authority will never dissolve itself. The Palestinian Authority will never scrap Oslo. Israel will scrap Oslo.
Right.
Israel will end security cooperation. Israel will scrap Oslo. The Palestinian Authority will never scrap Oslo. This is the only reason they exist. They are never going to do these things people are asking about. So, we can have this breathless commentary about, now is the time for the PA to begin. They're not going to do it. They will never do it. And Saeed, you write for Al-Quds, you know the individuals who are involved. Each one of them is jockeying for position for these fake titles of prime minister, for foreign minister, for ambassador, for chief negotiator, for president. You see the jockeying for position for these different empty seats. We talk about rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic. The Titanic would be is an exaggeration, right? I mean, this would be a blessing, right? Compared to the Palestinian Authority. But they're never going to scrap these agreements. They're never going to scrap these agreements. That is not, it's the only thing that gives them the access, one, to funding. Saeed, and this has been written about many times, the kind of salaries these ministers take, the kind of benefits they take, the positions and the VIP access and privileges whenever they want to cross the border. It's the only thing that gets them coming out of the Duffa, coming out of the West Bank, to go and be treated as heads of state. They will never scrap it, right? The Israelis will scrap it. The Israelis will scrap these agreements. The Palestinians will never scrap this agreement. Palestinian Authority, that is.
So I guess kind of heading towards wrapping this up, but I wanted to ask, so moving forward, because we talked about moving on with everything and with a binational state and everything, but how, as we talked about before, the Trump administration has basically, quote unquote, taken the Palestinian refugees issue off the table. And how do you see this moving forward? Like, let's say whether President Trump wins another term or not, but after that, let's say there's a more friendly administration. What do you see as the future of the question of Palestinian refugees, specifically the ones from 1948? How do you see this playing out? How can it be resolved? Because again, like you've both mentioned, the question of the 1948 refugees is something that Palestinians cannot just, give away. So how do you see this playing out in the future?
Well, let me say this. Let's talk about the potential for President Trump of winning a second term or not winning a second term. We know this. We know that his opponent, Joe Biden, said that he will keep the embassy in Jerusalem. So we know that, right? He also said that there's, whatever. He says that we will reopen the consulate. So we know that. We know that he's going to reopen the consulate. He says that we want to maintain the two-state solution alive. So he wants to go back, to the pre-Trump era where, this thing is being called for negotiations from time to time, send an envoy, meet Palestinians, maybe reopen the office in Washington, the PLO office in Washington, which for the life of me, I don't see any reason to reopen it, honestly. I mean, the Palestinians should say to the Americans, only when we realize our right do we want an office in Washington.
And we want an embassy.
That's a different issue.
If we don't want an office, we want an embassy, right?
Yeah, right. That's a different issue altogether. On the refugee issue, look, it is fundamental to the Palestinian continued existence. We will not give up on the refugee issue. They can do what they may. They can re-support UNRWA, which I think a friendlier administration, there's no guarantee that Biden will win. In fact, the numbers show the numbers today in the battleground states favor Mr. Trump. But suppose Biden wins, I think we will see a restoration of funding of UNRWA. But remember this. I mean, Osamah talked about this for a little bit. On UNRWA, when UNRWA was founded, it was pushed by the Americans, by the Europeans, and not the Arabs. The Arabs said we don't want it at the time. It was pushed by them to pacify the Palestinians, because they were afraid if there was, there's going to be an uprising, that our allies will be destabilized and so on, where there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees and so on. So we will see this, for us, for future Palestinian generations, for Palestinian historians and intellectuals and journalists and so on. Really, it is the time to begin number one, to begin the process of unity and reconciliation. That's what needs to be done. This bullshit, of Hamasistan and Ramallah and all these things and everything in between must end. They cannot, remain comfortable in their zone, whether it's Hamas or anybody else. That's number one. We need all to dedicate our resources and abilities and so on, so you can have true Palestinian. Second, you have to devote everything possible to create or maintain or go back to the culture of resistance. And I don't necessarily say that we must, or the Palestinians must espouse or adopt violent resistance means. No, but be creative. Be creative on how to resist this occupation. Third, you have to constantly work for an international solidarity support system, which we have, and look at the historical process, Muhammad and Osamah. We had the most support for the Palestinians when the Palestinians were resisting. During the first Intifada in 1987, during all the Intifadas, when the Palestinians are out there and fighting for the rights and so on.
Well, even in 2014, everybody's on the same.
Right. I mean, look. I mean, in 2014, it was just definitely the Palestinians will always resist, as we have seen in Gaza. They will always resist. But for the Israelis, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. And then what did Obama say? He came out and said, very blatantly, Israel has a right to defend itself, right? Israel has a right to defend itself. What that means, that is a euphemism for what? Israel has the right to destroy and kill the Palestinians, not to defend itself. What about self-defense? Should be a universal right? So when you say, and I asked this question so many times, do the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? Does Syria have a right to defend itself, and so on? How come, when it comes to all these people, does Venezuela have a right to defend itself? Look at all these things. So defending oneself is, a euphemism for this is our interest, this is our policy, this is our strategy, and so on. So to conclude, I just want to emphasize that the way forward is unity, creative resistance, put everything, every iota of energy under the umbrella of resistance. Whatever you do, whatever network you have, whatever article you write, whatever, it must, at the end of the day, pour into, sort of a fund. I say this, euphemistically, a fund to gather all this energy for resistance. Third, build a strong solidarity support in the Arab world and throughout. In things like, BDS, for instance, and see what is happening today. I think we see this thing as taking ground. So those ought to be the priorities.
Yeah, I agree with a number of Saeed's points. I want to take a step back and when we think about the U.S. elections, to think about the following. President Trump has been attempting, and this is one of the things about the deal of the century. We've talked about this connection between members of administration, including his son-in-law, and the Likud party, but there's also the vibrant Christian evangelical base of the Republican Party that have been major supporters of his, right? And in particular around this issue of support for Israel and the two kind of two pillars of it. One, the denial of a Palestinian state, but also a tougher stance on Iran. And of course, this also plays into who his major donors are. Sheldon Adelson and several other major funders, both for his 2016 campaign, for the 2018 Republican races, and now again for this 2020 campaign. And so many of these policies around the deal of the century is meant to appease them, not just the evangelical base, but his major donors. Here's the problem, and here's the rub when we look at a Joe Biden candidacy. To Saeed's point, Biden has already said that he's not going to move the embassy. The other problem is we know historically that Joe Biden has often bragged about his close relationship with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He called himself a Zionist time and again. Okay, long time friends, and this is beyond friendship because there's also this ideological affinity. Okay, so I think it's probably it is not a good sign, and many of those same key major donors of the Democratic Party share an ideological affinity with the key donors to the Republican Party when it comes to Israel, when it comes to the settlements, when it comes to treatment of the Palestinians. So I am not at all optimistic about a change, even if it's a change in tone. A change in tone doesn't benefit us, quite frankly, all right? A change in tone does not benefit Palestinians. What does benefit Palestinians, and I think to Saeed's point, is that there is a younger generation of voters who see and who have less of an affinity with the state of Israel, with its policies, particularly its policies of dispossession and erasure, everything we've talked about today toward the Palestinians. History of massive violence that toward the Palestinians. That, I think, for Palestinians is a hopeful sign, to Saeed's point. But it means working with the younger groups. It means working cross-sectionally with other key demographic groups in the United States to help affect change. Now, that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time, and we're talking about a generational shift. Okay, but that also means building up a effective international solidarity movement, and building up one that connects with a solidarity movement in the United States that pushes for equal rights for everyone. And this is the problem when we come back to the two-state solution, not to revisit this, Muhammad, but that the focus on high politics and negotiation, the focus on the negotiators from the Palestinian Authority and what they might do and what this might mean for the refugees when it's not going to happen, what that does is it negates the work on the ground of any kind of international solidarity, because that's not what they want. That's what, in fact, that's exactly what they've tried to eliminate over the past 3 to 4 decades, and especially since Oslo was signed. So it's really important, I think, for your viewers, for us to start thinking about, as we start thinking about what is the strategy. Let's say, forget about, and this was the point I made earlier, forget about what is the Palestinian Authority going to dissolve itself, etc. What do we do to surpass the Palestinian Authority, both as Palestinians on the ground in Palestine and in the United States and in Europe and Canada, etc. How do we start to build up an international coalition around things like BDS, around things like equal rights? Very simple, equality. It's very simple. And this is where we can look at other nonviolent struggles, as we've seen, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in whether we see in South Africa, and we see the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, or as we look at other examples from around the world, anti-colonial movements around the world, that give us some examples that we can draw on. And I think that's where, if there is hope, that's where the hope is at the end of the story.
All right. Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you both, Dr. Osamah and Saeed Arikat. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you having you here, and I'm sure everybody online has appreciated this discussion. So thank you, and
My pleasure. Thanks for doing
we'll
it.
have you guys on again later.
All right.
But thank you. This was great, and we will talk to you soon. And thank you for everybody online. We appreciate you tuning in, and for everybody. You can also find this video later on our website. It will be posted. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, of course, to our speakers. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Muhammad. Thank you, Saeed.
Bye.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.
Take
Take
care.
care.